2005 to 2017. Most of you know him. I'll give a brief introduction and we'll let him tell you a little bit more about himself in a second. He's a retired cardiovascular and thoracic surgeon. While in the House of Representatives, he served on the powerful House Ways and Means Committee and chaired 3 of its subcommittees. So he's recognized as an expert in international trade, healthcare, tax policy, and U.S. foreign policy. So we're very grateful to have him here with us today. We also have former Senator Mary Landrieu, who served in the Senate for 3 terms from 1997 through 2015. During her 18-year tenure, she chaired the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Committee, the Homeland Security Appropriations Committee, and was the first Democratic woman to serve on the Armed Services Committee. So both of these folks here are credited with several different and very important pieces of legislation, but we're here today to talk about their experiences around Katrina, since Senator Landrieu had been in the Senate for a little while, but Representative Busini had been recently elected and they served different areas of state, with Mary, across the state, but from New Orleans, and Representative Busini here in the Acadiana region in Southwest. So understanding that all of the issues that happened in the Southeast, again, happened during Katrina, we saw sort of a repeat when Rita hit. So the first thing I want you guys to do is just tell our audience a little bit about one experience that sticks out for you with Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Rita. Want to start?
So I remember I was in my first year as an elected congressman, and in July I was at a meeting, actually it was a small dinner meeting to talk about national security and terrorism. And we had some intelligence officials, and one of them mentioned to me, I don't think any of our cities are prepared for a major disaster. And little did I know, a month later, we saw it happen, as you all know, with Hurricane Katrina. And I remember when I heard the news that, first off, we were relieved that when the hurricane made landfall, as you heard, we thought we had dodged the bullet. But when I heard the news that levees had been breached and there was flooding going on in New Orleans, I immediately made arrangements to fly over New Orleans to see what was going on. And so within an hour of finding out the news, I was in the air having a look at what happened. And it was just absolutely stunning to see the water just gushing through these levees and watching all of this in real time. So I got back to Lafayette, and we were trying to get more information about what was going on, who was doing what. And Richard Zuslag called me, kind of in a panic, and he had his operations center full bore going ahead with communications, ambulances being dispatched, every asset he had brought to the table to deal with all this. And interestingly, he had the most effective communication system in the afflicted area because he had portable equipment he could set up. And so we were getting real-time information. So I went over to his facility, his communication center, and we were picking up information. And he asked me to stay because he said, look, this is devastating. I had seen it firsthand myself. So I immediately called the White House, and I got some senior staff on the line. And I started explaining that this is a situation that's going to be well beyond, I think, what the city and the state can do alone, and it's going to tax our federal emergency management system as well. And it literally took me about 2 days to get it through their heads that this was serious and that we needed a federal response. Finally, by that Friday after the storm had made landfall, the First Lady came to Lafayette, Laura Bush, and I spent about 5 hours with her. Took her over to the Cajun Dome where local authorities, local officials, and business people had set up a first-rate center to help out those who had been evacuated. And we took her through that, and I remember taking her to the airport, and she looked at me and said, "What else do you need?" And I told her I need 15 minutes on the phone with her husband. And sure enough, the next morning, I got a phone call at 6 a.m. with George Bush. And President Bush told me that on Monday, I'm going to be in Baton Rouge. The governor's been contacted. We're contacting the rest of the delegation. And we're going to be there, and I will have cabinet secretaries with me. I know Mary remembers that as well. We had a real come to Jesus meeting about who's going to do what, and that we definitely needed a federal response. So, Walt, you mentioned legislators should just get out of the way. I didn't get out of the way, but I think I played a role in prodding President Bush to step into the breach and where he was needed. So from then on, we actually started to see the kind of response that was needed, at least in the emergency phase, where under General Honoré, we had military assets to help out with the logistics, which were desperately needed, because this was just beyond anything any of us had dealt with before. So needless to say, about 8 months into my first year in office, it was a little bit of a baptism by fire, and I learned a lot in the process. One other little vignette I'm going to skip over. I remember right after Rita, and the waters had basically departed, and we were dealing with the aftermath. I had gone down to the southern part of Vermilion Parish to just see firsthand what had gone on. We were driving down a back road, and I see this elderly guy hauling trash out across his front yard, which was just a big mud pit. And I stopped, and I said, "Can I see your house? Would you take me into your house?" And sure enough, we walked across the mud and went into the house. And it was one of the most impactful sights I'd ever seen, where major appliances had been shoved through walls by the force of the water. The mud in the house was about 3 feet thick. It was a mess. It smelled awful in there. And we went into the living room, and that room was equally devastated. But on a mantle over a little fireplace was a picture of his family. It was still there. It was mud splattered, but it was still there. And it just struck me and I still have that image seared into my mind today, because it just reminded me then and reminded me throughout my time in public service, this is what we do. We take care of our families, our people. We represent our state, our district, and we don't stop until we get problems solved. So with that, I'll stop there. Mary?
Thank you so much, Representative Bustani. And let me just say that Charles was amazing as a fighter for us in Washington. Our delegation did work as closely as we could together and fiercely as we could together to try to bring as much money and support to the state as we could. And each of us took a different role, and each of us delivered on, depending on the committees we were on. But I can remember fondly, and I want you all to know this, that the House of Representatives, the Republicans, worked very, very closely with us in the Senate to see what we could do to bring support for the state. So I want to thank Charles specifically, Jim McCreary, Richard Baker. Some of these members are no longer, none of us are still in office in the positions we were. The two memories that I'll point out, there are actually three, and I'm going to do them really quickly. One was in the command center the morning after Katrina struck on a Sunday night, as I remember, early Monday morning. So this is Monday midday, when the Corps of Engineers' voice came over to tell us for the first time that the levees had failed in New Orleans. And as a lifelong resident of New Orleans, living in Broadmoor, where I grew up, I could literally close my eyes and see the city filling up with water, because I know where the 17th Street Canal is, I know where the London Street Canal is, I know what the lower 9th Ward looks like. And I can remember my heart literally just stopped a couple of beats, and I thought, holy moly. And then I remember asking, did it break on the New Orleans side or the Jefferson Parish side? And they said it broke on the New Orleans side. So that was one of the most shocking moments. I can't really describe because there was nothing, but in my mind, I could see the city filling up. And worse, I realized that there were probably only maybe 100 people, perhaps, in and around that maybe even less, that really understood what was happening, which was even more frightening. And I was absolutely sure at that moment that no one in Washington understood how fast the city would fill up with water. So I was in a really state of shock. The other point of shock was when Governor Blanco and I went up in the helicopter right after we could. We were one of the first helicopters up when the National Guard could take us up. And to see the expanse of the flooding was just horrifying. I mean, to be on the ground and see it is one thing, but to get up in a helicopter, right as, and you could still see the water flooded, it was just breathtaking in the destruction, the height of the water, the roofs floating in St. Bernard, that's all you could see in St. Bernard were the roofs of the houses. That was shocking. And then one of my other most poignant memories was when I eventually made it down after, I guess, a week or two, got down to Cameron Parish, and this might have been after Rita hit, so it might have been like 3 weeks, and went down to Cameron Parish, and Cameron was virtually destroyed. And I saw a workman in overalls, sleeping on a slab. He was laying down, and I said, "Are you okay?" He said, "Oh yes, ma'am, this is my house." And I said, "Well, what are you doing here?" He said, "Well, they called me back to work." And I'm setting up, I'm trying to, repair the pipelines so we can get the oil and gas turned on for the country. And he was literally sleeping on a slab. And hanging on the slab was the only thing left in his house was a rosary. And I've never forgotten that as long as I live. And it brings me to what I want to share with you all this morning after listening all morning to the most amazing stories of Katrina and Rita and what we did right, what we did wrong, what we could do better. I can say positively for certain to you all right now, the federal government still doesn't understand what's going on down here. Sadly. Not the Democrats, not the Republicans, not the independents. The federal government has so much more to learn about what Louisiana does, who we are, what we contribute, how much we fight and work and support this country. And one day, if we keep working at it, raise our voices together, stay together, the federal government may understand the treasure that this state is, and that we give far more than we ever take to the federal government in terms of resources and workers and support. So I'll stop there, answer your questions, but that visual will never leave my mind, and I want us to continue to be encouraged by all the things that we have looking forward, and to say we always will need the federal government as a partner, and we can get better ourselves as we learn how to deal with these more frequent, ever-increasing storms and challenges coming our way.
Yeah, that's a really touching story. So thinking about, our last panel, they talked a little bit about funding, and they talked about one-time funding from the federal government and the impact of it. They also talked about regrets from not taking one-time federal funding. Someone has to be in Washington to get that federal funding. Could you walk us through, Senator Landrieu, what that looked like in the Senate? Now, you're a Democrat. We had a Republican, so now we have 2 Republicans, but at the time we had one on either side of the aisle. Talk us through what that looked like, trying to go to bat for funding for Louisiana in the wake of the storm.
Well, first of all, you all will remember, and I still think this is true, that Katrina and Rita were the largest, most devastating, most deadly, and most expensive disasters to ever hit the United States of America. Hard stop. The money, you can Google this, I Googled it this morning, it was well north of $150 billion. The federal government had never, ever, ever seen a disaster like this before. There was no comparison to it before. So they had been, whatever, used to like a little swimming pool, and we were an Olympic-sized disaster. I mean, none of their equipment, none of their programs, none of their strategies that they had tabletopped were the size of this. That's number one. Number two, thank God that I was on the Appropriations Committee. And I want to thank God, because I wanted to be on the Armed Services Committee, and I was. I thought that would be a good thing for me to do, not that appropriations wasn't important, but I was forced, literally, to get on the appropriations a little bit against my will. And you think how funny this is. If I hadn't been on the Appropriations Committee, we would have not had a senator on the Appropriations Committee when Katrina hit. And that's very important. I'm trying to remember who was on approps in the House, if we had anybody on approps in the House. Because you all know how the Appropriations Committees work. That is where the Money Committee. And also, I thank God, that Robert Byrd was the chair of the Appropriations Committee in the Senate. Because when Governor Blanco picked up the phone and said to me, Senator, no matter how much money they send to us under these regular programs, we're trying to look at what's available to us, nothing is going to be enough. We've got to get extra funding. We, the Louisiana delegation, and one day the story will be written, we didn't get one supplemental, we didn't get two supplementals, we didn't get three supplementals, I think we got 5 or 6 supplementals to bring money to the state. You go look at all the other disasters, they may get a half one, they may get 1, they may get 2. We got 5 or 6. That's how hard we worked, how long we worked, we were able to finally explain to the federal government the depth of the destruction. St. Bernard Parish, I talked to Joey DeFava last week. Joey was a city council member and a dear champion after Katrina. I asked Joey, I said, Joey, help me with my memory, because I'm going to go speak to everyone in Lafayette. How many water meters were running in St. Bernard a week after the storm? He said, I can tell you definitively there were 5. 67,000 people lived in St. Bernard Parish. The week after the storm, it was so wholly devastated, there were 5 water meters running, and he told me there were 2 houses, 1 industrial site, and 2 small commercial. That was what the lower Ninth Ward looked like, wholly devastated. Lakeview was wholly devastated. No other city in America has ever taken a hit or region like ours where 70% of the houses were uninhabitable. So I'll stop there, just the scope of this disaster. So we should be proud as Louisiana, as messy and as tough as it was. We achieved something that no other region in this country, I believe, has ever really done as well. We've rebuilt our hospital system, is better than before. We rebuilt almost every public housing unit. Not as many as we had, but what we do have is the best. I trust you to come see it. You can't even find a piece of litter on the ground in public housing. That's how good we rebuilt it. We rebuilt almost every school in New Orleans and rebuilt a new school system. We rebuilt the finest levee system in the country in and around New Orleans, and that continues as we try to help all of our region. So I'm not going to just say all the positive things. There were some mistakes we made. Of course, I'll be the first to admit. But I want you all in this room to be proud, because every single one of you did something, whether you were in Baton Rouge or a host city or Lafayette, a host city, or helped in the region. And we should be proud of helping this country to understand what a long-term, consistent disaster response could look like and how important it is to work together.
Well said, Mary. And I remember Mary and I having conversations back then about, yes, we're in a partisan environment, and the House particularly was all Republican and very conservative. Run by Tom DeLay, for instance, and Denny Hastert at the time. And I remember talking to Mary, because I was still relatively new, obviously, and I said, look, we're going to talk on a regular basis. We're going to communicate, and we're going to help each other. We're not going to play partisan politics with this. And I remember my Louisiana colleagues in our delegation felt the same way. Jim McCreary and Baker and all, we worked really closely together. But the House works differently, and it's a partisan body just by design, and it's very difficult. Fortunately, prior to getting on the Ways and Means Committee, in my first term, I was on 3 committees: Education, Agriculture, and Transportation and Infrastructure. 3 key committees that were going to be very important in our recovery. And I've worked hard to build a reputation in the House as somebody who's not going to go showboat. I'm not going to speak about every issue, but I'm going to speak about things I know about and develop that kind of rapport with the committee chairman and with leadership. And I remember we were having a closed-door Republican meeting specifically on how are we going to deal with this disaster down in Louisiana. And there were a lot of people in the House, Republicans and Democrats, who didn't want to put any money into salvaging New Orleans. They said it's time to evacuate. And we had a real uphill battle in fighting that. So one of the things I was able to do, I was able to get the chairman of those 3 committees I mentioned to come down to Louisiana and do field hearings with me. And we did that, and seeing is believing. And when they saw the magnitude of the problem, then I had allies, at least on those committees, in positions of authority, who could then help me convince the rest of the House, along with our colleagues McCrary and Baker and others. So I remember in a closed-door meeting, standing up in front of all the Republicans, and I said, I know you guys are all fiscal conservatives. That was back in the day when the Republicans were really fiscally conservative. But,
Thank you for clarifying that, Charles.
But they didn't want to spend any money. And I said, listen, I can tell you what's going on back home in my state. People are suffering. They've lost their homes. They've lost their businesses. And it could happen to you. And if it happened to you, you would be in the same position I'm in today, coming to ask for federal assistance. And I said, secondly, I'm not going to tell you you got to spend money on this and that and this and that without having evidence and information and data to back what my ask is. And when I ask, I expect every one of you in this room to help me out. And that was my speech. It was brief, to the point. And afterwards, I talked to a lot of guys in some of these other delegations, from South Carolina and Tennessee, who felt like they would never be afflicted with these kinds of problems. And they said, we're going to help. And so we built support that way. And the other difficulty we had in the House, in the Senate, you have 100 senators. They can sit and meet, discuss things, and decide a plan a little bit easier than we can in the House. The problem we had in the House was that Tom DeLay and Denny Hastert wanted to run things through the separate committees, through what we call regular order. You have a committee hearings, then you pass separate legislation, and then you address that problem. The other committee does that, and the other committee does that. And the whole thing about that was it was going to be far too slow. And so we had to work to expedite that process. And of course, Mary and David at the time worked through a big package that would encompass everything, which we were able to use to make our arguments in the House to expedite the facilitation of this in the House. But I can tell you it was not easy. And one of the reasons we had 6 or 7 supplementals is because, it took time to twist some arms. And that's what we did.
And it took time to twist arms, and it took time to get some information back from the street, like how devastated, what were the estimates of the devastation. But that was an interesting question because I kept telling people, why don't you just get up in a helicopter and take a picture? I mean, you can see, you can kind of generally estimate, like St. Bernard is completely destroyed, but oh, no, that wasn't good enough for the federal government. They had to wait till the water went down in St. Bernard. And then they had to send a whole bunch of people out to measure, was it a 4-inch branch or a 6-inch branch? Was it the whole roof off or half the roof off? You know, I mean, it was just mind-numbing. And so I'm not going to relive all those horror stories, but I will say that eventually, and Paul Rainwater can keep me honest here, at some point we realized, hell, we just need to send money down there in block grants. And we made them up. There weren't community development. I mean, there were community development block grants. There was no such thing as disaster block grants. We made that up. Thank God we did. We just said, we have a community development block grant program. Let's just put disaster development block grant and send it down and let them try to figure it out. We changed so many rules, but I can remember the FEMA director coming to me, telling me, of course he was totally unqualified to be the FEMA director. He had run the Arabian Horse Association as a prior experience to running FEMA, so he didn't know a damn thing. So he kept trying to tell me what to do. I said, let me explain something to you. I don't care what your rules are. I don't care what your rule book says. I don't care what your programs were. None of it is going to work for the situation that we're dealing with here. So I'm going to change some laws. And so that's what I did. And thank goodness I was on the Appropriations Committee and on the Homeland Security Committee, so I could change the laws. And I had Republican delegation in the House supporting me. I wasn't just making this stuff up for myself. I would go talk to them. I'd say, what do you all think about this? They'd say, go for it. So I could do it a little bit easier in the Senate than they could in the House. But I'll tell you, I would never have been able to do it without their support, because they would call President Bush and they would say, she's right, you know, this is what we have to do. So it really was a team effort. And you know, for Jim McCrary from Shreveport to be as leaning in, and Richard Baker from Baton Rouge, of course, let me say about Richard Baker and to Baton Rouge, and Lafayette's here. They were host communities. Do you know 100,000 people moved to Baton Rouge in a weekend? Do you understand that impact to Baton Rouge? Can you imagine? Walt, you remember this. And we probably had 30 or 40,000 people move here to Lafayette. You all remember the impact to everything. So while New Orleans and St. Bernard and Plaquemine were destroyed and parts of Jefferson Parish, the other parts of the state were feeling the impacts too. And so I think that's what helped us, the Senate and the House members, for the whole state to think, you know, we kind of are in this together. And then, of course, Rita hit, so Southwest Louisiana was reeling a few weeks later. So it was really a very unifying, I think, a proud time for Louisiana in many ways. And there are lasting legacies for this nation that we insisted happen, and it's helped thousands of children all over America, thousands, like mental health. There was no FEMA mental health. We made it up, because I went to them and I said, we are going crazy down here. Do you understand? Like, we're losing our minds. Send us some psychiatrists. Oh, you really think you need that? Yes. Yes, our people are suffering, not just physically, but mentally. So they implemented. And you know, you can thank Raymond Jetson and some of the legislators. They call me, says, our people are flipping out. I said, I understand, I'm flipping out myself. So we need therapy, you know, I mean, that is now part of the recovery. The whole pet issue, y'all remember that? They wouldn't take the pets, and we said, yes, we're not leaving without our pets. Now FEMA takes pets all the time. Whether you think that's good or not, I don't know. But I mean, we changed the way that the federal government responds to disasters. So the people in Sandy, when they were hurt, they were benefited. So we made a lot of good decisions, not all good, but we made the best we could in the circumstances.
Can I just add something that I was really proud to be a thorn in President Bush's side for a while, and you know, we ultimately became good friends. At one point, he was sick and tired of hearing from me. But the real unsung heroes in all of this were our staff. They did an amazing job, because Mary mentioned the need to get information. And they worked night and day to get information at the local level, whether it's from farmers, from business owners, and so forth, to understand what the needs were. We couldn't have done that without those unsung heroes who served as our staff during that time.
And working closely with Governor Blanco and her team were amazing. And they were under such pressure, politically and otherwise, as a Democratic governor, and you had a Republican president. So that's a whole other story that could be written. But we'll go forward here and just keep on the positive side. And so, but she was very good about coming up with plans with the Recovery District to come to Washington and have the facts and figures. Paul and Andy and others had the facts and figures to say, yep, you know, you all shortchanged this. And I'll tell you this one story, and Andy Copeland, if he was here, he would tell you. In one of the second supplementals, the president decided to give Mississippi, I'll remember these numbers, $5.4 billion. And they gave us 7.8. And Haley Barber had written this down on a piece of paper and given it to the president. He was the governor of Mississippi, very close friends with the president. He said, this is what I need 5.4 billion. And so they gave us, they only had 12 to split, they gave us the rest. Well, I took my piece of paper out. I used to be the state treasurer, so I know how to add and subtract. So I took some, you know, just off the back of the envelope, and I'm thinking, how many homes did they lose? How many homes did we lose? How many people died there? How many people? And I figured out that they had shortchanged us $3.2 billion. And I said, I'm not going to accept this number. And the president said, well, that's what you're going to get. I said, no, that's not what I'm going to get. I said, look, this is, I didn't tell him this directly, but communicated. I said, it's not that we're upset that you gave Mississippi this amount of money. We just want our fair share. If you would calculate this correctly based on their numbers and our numbers. So everybody kept saying, Senator, you'll never be able to get another $3.2 billion. I said, you watch me. And so I went and showed these numbers to the Appropriations Committee. Literally, Robert Byrd, this is how the Senate works, different than the House. Robert Byrd took out his pen, he looked at Chuck, his clerk, and said, write her in for $3.2 billion. And I sent it to Governor Blanco. And that's how the Road Home program got fully funded, because if we wouldn't have gotten that money, we couldn't have done the Road Home program. It wasn't perfect. I didn't design it, the state designed it. I'm not saying I wasn't proud of it. I gave my opinion, it wasn't my job. My job, our job, was to get the resources. The state's job was to figure out how they wanted to allocate it. But Governor Blanco never could have possibly come up with a program like that without the money, and she was shortchanged. So, you know, literally on her deathbed, we were talking about this because we were very close. And the weeks before she was dying, and we recalled how closely we worked together to make sure that Louisiana got its fair share. And then there are lots of other stories I could tell you about additional funding that we got, but we just weren't going to let the federal government shortchange us or not really understand what we needed. And I hope that the locals spent it as well as we tried to fight for it.
Well, certainly listening to that, the spirit of collaboration across the aisle was there as you were working to make that happen. So just thinking about funding here, we've talked about these one-time funds that we brought to Louisiana to help with recovery, thinking long-term about our coast, about our communities. There were some other different bills that went through. I'm thinking specifically about like the Go Mesa, things that help us think about where our state can be in the future and the funding that we need to sustain our coast, our environment, our communities. Talk to us a little bit about, you know, one-time funds versus reoccurring funds that we have, and how really the work that our federal delegation does is contributing to, you know, keeping Louisiana resilient against the next disaster.
I want to say a word about Go Mesa, and then I'll turn it over to Charles to add whatever he wants. But the reason that you hear this Go Mesa, Go Mesa, Go Mesa coming from me, it stands for the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act. We can call it the Gulf of America Energy Security Act. I don't care what we call it, as long as we get our money out of it, okay? The reason that Go Mesa was important, it was the first time the federal government had ever, in 2006, it was passed after Katrina. Now, our delegation had been working on this concept for 25 years before Katrina hit. We were not asleep at the wheel. John Breaux was working on this when I was in college. Bennett Johnson was working on this. Russell Long was working on this. Billy Tozan was working on this. Our delegation was not asleep at the wheel. The federal government was deaf, and they still are sort of deaf, and in this case, in my view, dumb, because they don't understand exactly what we're trying to explain to them, and why I don't know why they don't understand it. Because the Louisiana, with Port Fourchon, Highway 1, and all of our coastal parishes, which are 20, not Lafayette, not Ascension, but they could be added if they wanted to. It's a whole other thing. But anyway, our parishes down here support an offshore industry that is the best in the world. The best in the world, the offshore industry. We sort of helped everyone in the world develop their offshore resources, every widget, every gadget. The federal government takes out of the Gulf of Mexico every year roughly $2 to $4 to $5 billion, and have for decades. If you add it up, it's more than $200 billion. They have left us crumbs. All right, 200 billion, get this in your head, 200 billion. That's a lot of money. 1 billion is a lot. 200 billion? How many rocks do you think Gordy could put up with 200 billion? How many levees, how many diversion projects could we build? If we could just get our fair share of that, in my view, in our view, and we agree on this, 50% of that money should come to us. We should have gotten $100 billion over the last many years. We could be like Saudi Arabia or Texas or, Walt, and we could have the finest universities. We deserve it. Why? The interior states get 50% of their funding. Alaska gets 70% of its funding. We get 4%. The bill that I passed gets 4%. We asked for 50, we got 4. Now, if you all know any other big source of money that you all want to go after to support our coast, which we need about $1 billion a year to do whatever we decide to do, we can't do it with much less effectively than about $1 billion, and I'm roughing it. It could be $1.5 billion, it could be $1.2 billion, it could be 900. Denise, you have to tell us. She's shaking her head. So I trust people like that to give me information. But there are other sources that we could get. But the first thing we need to do is get the federal government to share those resources of offshore oil and gas. And if we have offshore wind, we'll take a portion of that. If we have geothermal, we can take a portion of that and commit it to our coast or to what the legislature believes.
Well, the fight to get federal funding from the offshore revenues was a long fight. I mean, that started back during the Truman administration. And sadly, the powers that be in the state, Governor Long and others, Leander Perez, they asked for a hell of a lot more and got zeroed. And Louisiana delegations, year after year after year, from the Truman administration until we got to the Mesa Pass, those delegations have been unsuccessful. So it was an incremental win. Mary played a huge role in the Senate in moving it forward. The House was always going to be a major problem, and I can tell you we were going to lose it in the House because the fiscal conservatives back then didn't want to do it. And because of my relationship with John Boehner, I was one of only 2 freshman members of Congress when I first came in, helped him become Speaker of the House. John owed me some things. And
That's good.
so I went to him in his office and I said, listen, I know you're hearing from the people on the right, they don't want to do this at all. There's a competing bill that will never get through the House. It's asking for too much. I would like that. I wish we could pass it, but we're not going to get that. So we need to take this bill that passed in the House because it's the only sure thing moving. And he basically went to bat for me to get that done. And that's how we ultimately got through the House and it became law. Now, is it enough? Not by a stretch. We need a lot more, as you all have heard all morning about this. And fundamentally, if I can get a little bit on the theoretical side, at the federal level, we are so dependent upon a federal income tax system. But the sad thing is we've got massive deficit spending and massive growing debt. And I think, personally, having worked on tax reform, the income tax system is antiquated. It will never meet the needs of what's going to need to be done in this, states like ours, but also at the federal level. So ultimately, the Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee are going to have to get really serious and start looking at new ways of taxation that either supplement or scrap the income tax system and go to a different type of system. I don't know what that is yet. I spent a lot of time studying it, but the fact of the matter is that at the federal level, this is something that has to be done, but I'm not seeing anything close to that kind of activity in Congress. They're too busy performing in front of cameras and not doing the kind of work that they need to do, holding serious hearings, looking at real information, consulting with experts, and doing the right thing to solve these problems for our country.
And let me just, I want to just add one thing about coastal. So the GOMESA funding that's out there that comes into the federal government, the revenues from severance and royalties that the oil and gas companies pay. And by the way, under Donald Trump's administration, leases are going to be mandatory. I actually agree with that. Some people don't, but I actually agree with that. So the revenues are going to be increasing out of the Gulf of Mexico, Randy, increasing. And we should right now put our, foot to the accelerator and ask for more funding. And we should depend on Governor Landry's good relationship with President Trump to push this right now. And Secretary Burgum is the Interior Secretary. He was a former governor. He's a good friend of Jeff Landry's. And if our legislature will put their shoulder to this wheel, we could get President Trump to say, not only am I changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, but I'm going to help the states that help us be energy dominant, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, who are the host states, to get their fair share. Why should I just send all of this money to blue states that are getting it now? I mean, if you really want to be just tough politics here, this is the time for this state that voted for Donald Trump to get something from the president that should have been given to us many presidents ago. President Truman offered it to us. Remember that. We screwed that deal up. So it's a long, sad story. You can Google it and look and read the history. But we don't have to screw this up. We can get this done correctly. And this is the time for the Republican leaders. Let me say on the coastal thing. Before Katrina, the federal government, I don't even think, and I know I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but let me just say how proud I am of the work we've done. The federal government did not even really see their coastal communities. You know what I'm saying? Like when you say, I see you, that means I see you, I understand you. They didn't understand us, the coastal community. 60% of our population lives within 50 miles of the coast. Trust me on this. The federal government, when they go to work, they see the interior of the country. I was on the committee. It's called the Senate Committee on Natural Resources, Interior and Natural Resources. Before it was the Committee on Energy, before it was Energy, it was just the Committee of the Interior. Okay, the history of the country, go westward, all the western lands, that's the way the federal government sees the country. It sees it east and west. It doesn't see the coast. Katrina made the entire country understand what a coastal community really looks like. Not just beaches where people vacation, but what the fishermen look like, what the rice farmers look like, how much the coastal community. So it changed the federal government, and in a good way. And so now the federal government is starting, there's no Department of the Coast, think about that, no Department of the Coast, not one. The jurisdiction's split between many different, so if it's split, nobody owns it. So we in Louisiana, what Chip Klein says is correct. We might be last in a lot of things, but you know what we're first on? We're first in explaining why the coast is important. What does a coastal community look like? How do you make a living below sea level? How can you survive below sea level? How can you build to be resilient? Now Virginia has adopted a master plan modeled on us. The Great Lakes are looking at what we've done. So I want this community here to be proud. We haven't achieved everything. We have a big debate right now on the master plan. You saw that earlier this morning. We've got to figure that out and come to some compromise. We cannot let our first place position in this country slip. Not because we want to be proud, but because the rest of the nation depends on us to lead. We understand we can't barricade ourselves from the water. We have to learn to live with it. A combination of natural, man-made and barriers. So we learned that after Katrina. That's a hard lesson learned. Let's not unlearn it. Let's keep moving forward and try to base our master plan as best we can. There are lots of people in this country depending on us to get this correct.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And one of the things about living in a coastal community is having insurance. So as we're thinking about the issues that our state can handle versus what maybe we need help from our federal government, from the private sector, insurance has been a huge challenge. So after Katrina, a lot of insurance companies either stopped writing policies or left the state completely. What role does our federal government have in helping keep people in their homes? Because they have homeowners insurance, flood insurance, all of these things. What's the role there for the federal government versus the state?
Well, there is a definite role for the federal government in this. Sadly, both parties have failed over time. We've talked a lot about the flood insurance program, but there are fundamental flaws in that program that have not been addressed. But I think it's a bigger problem in that, in looking at insurance, you have what happens in the state, then you have reinsurance, which backs the insurance companies, and then who backs the reinsurance companies? And what we're seeing with the plethora of natural disasters around this country and around the world, not only are the insurance companies under stress, the reinsurance industry is also under stress. And so we really need the federal government to step in with a plan, because this has to be a layered system with the proper backups. And the final backup is some kind of federal support. So how we do that is the question. I think what Congress ought to be doing, and right now we've got the Speaker of the House from Louisiana, the Majority Leader in the House from Louisiana, they need to make this a priority.
Amen.
They need to start having hearings on this, and not just simply looking at how to tweak the flood insurance, the National Flood Insurance Program, but what do we really need to do long term to fix the bigger crisis that's going on. And I'm just not seeing that kind of activity. Back in the day, when I was in the House, a lot of times we would have a problem, we would have a series of hearings. In years prior to my time in office, if you look back historically, Congress oftentimes had hearings over the course of months or even years on big problems like this. That is not going on right now. And I would challenge the leaders, the two leaders in the House from Louisiana, to step it up and do something about that on this particular problem of insurance.
I would say amen, because I can tell you all, and I don't have to tell you all this because you hear it with your own ears, this is probably one of the most difficult and difficult issues that our people are facing right now. There are people that cannot afford their homes. The market is flat. People are not going to be moving into Louisiana. We cannot grow our economy if the middle class cannot afford insurance on their home. It is the single greatest asset of any. They just can't do it. And Charles is absolutely right. We have two of the most powerful people in the United States right now. They should be calling hearings. This is an existential threat to Louisiana, to every parish, not just the coastal parishes, to every parish. And what is the answer? A lot of people are starting to think about a program that's private, public-private, but maybe backed up, like Charles said, in some way by the federal government, that's catastrophic homeowners insurance. Because it used to be the California people would tell us, we're not helping you, Mary, we don't have floods in California. Well, hell, they have wildfires now. The people in North Carolina said, we live on a mountain, we're going to need to help you all. Then Asheville flooded, the top of the darn mountain. Now they understand it. Tennessee, the rivers are flooding. Oklahoma, the tornadoes. The country is ready for this kind of leadership. If we put something together where every homeowner in the country has to pay a little bit for catastrophic, then if something happens and your home is catastrophically destroyed beyond your control, it burns up or you know, if a hurricane comes, you can recover. How does a country survive without this? You know, think about that. How does it? And we are like the canary in the coal mine down here. Florida is like this, but I also understand Pennsylvania has over 70,000. And so it's not just the Gulf Coast states, Walt. It's, you know, Pennsylvania has like 70,000 people that have flood insurance. Who knew? I didn't know that. But if we banded together with some states from the north, the west, the south, and went to Mike Johnson and Steve Scalise and demanded that they come up with some kind of solution, it will lift our whole economy. It'll be much faster than the legislature trying to tweak this and tweak that. It really needs to be a national response. Our people are crying for it and need us to respond.
All right, well, as we're getting to the end here, I'm getting time to wrap up. I'd just like to ask you to leave our audience with an answer to like one last question. And so when Hurricane Katrina happened and then Rita after that, there was questions at sort of the national scale of like, should we even recover? Should we be rebuilding? And so looking back at 20 years, you know, that was a question that you were probably getting from newspapers, from the media, like, should we be spending this money? Was it worth it? So looking back at 20 years, was it worth it? Like all the work that was put in to do it, like here we have vibrant communities again. Like what would you say to federally elected officials, you know, for the next big disaster?
Well, it's absolutely worth it. This is who we are. This is where we live. And the existential threats that we've dealt with are also situations that other places are going to deal with in the future if they haven't done so far. So clearly there's a federal role for this. And with any emergency, you have to have the ability to either scale up or scale back depending on the magnitude of the situation. We saw that with Katrina. The state was doing everything possible. We needed federal help. Ultimately, we got federal help to help us get going. It was messy. It was very difficult. We learned a lot from the process. Hats off to Louisiana. Louisiana, as we heard this morning from many on the other panels, Louisiana has put reforms together on dealing whether it's with healthcare issues or the infrastructure, all the problems, the emergency response, the way it's layered. Louisiana has implemented reforms and is a model for the rest of the country. The federal government not only hasn't done much to advance that, there are steps going in the wrong direction right now, in the opposite direction. I remember trying to get discussion going about how can we improve FEMA, what can be done to enhance its capabilities. Is it the right fit? How do we scale up when you hit that threshold between what the state can do and what's needed beyond that? That has not been settled from a policy standpoint, and a lot of that needs to be done. So yes, there is a strong federal role, and I would certainly urge those in Congress now to take it seriously and to start looking at those kinds of options.
Yeah, I would just, conclude, with just thanking you all. I'm not going to answer. I'm just going to thank everybody for putting this together. I really want to honor Governor Blanco's memory and her legacy and what an extraordinary leader she was. I was there the day she walked into the Louisiana legislature as the first woman elected from this area. She was a mom with six children, which was quite unique back then. It's still unique to have 6 children today, but back in the day, to be a legislator with 6 children, I was single. I was 23. She came in when she was in her 30s. We became very fast friends, and to honor her legacy, so many, and Randy, I see you, and others, and President Savoy, and Ramesh, and so many leaders here at UL, and Kim, to put this public policy together, because as Louisianians, we need to be a little more serious than we are sometimes about public policy, and a little bit more respectful of the role that government plays, both at the federal, state, and local level with the private sector, and how at times of emergencies we need to really respect each other and work together better. and to be proud of what we've done. I'll say this in ending, Kathleen would say this if she were here, unless the federal government wants to move the Mississippi River, I think there are always going to be some people here who need to run it, and that's what the hell we do. We run the biggest river system on the planet, and if it wasn't for the Mississippi River, the United States of America would look a lot like Australia. Okay? We aren't Australia. We're the greatest nation ever conceived and built in large measure because of this amazing artery that runs down the middle of it, where 70% of the grain comes to the world down this river. If they think they can find 5 million people, 4.5 million people to come live here and run the river, go find them. We're the ones that are putting up with all the things like mosquitoes and heat and all the things we do to run this river system, grow our crops, run the offshore oil and gas industry, teach every country in the world how to get resources out of 10,000 and 20,000 feet of water. I told Denny Hassard, you go find 5 million people that work as hard as we do, God bless you. Nobody does. Thank you.